You ever think about how well you really know your neighbors? That couple next door with the perfect lawn, the friendly waves every morning, the kids playing baseball in the backyard? What if I told you that during the Cold War, thousands of Americans lived next to Soviet spies for decades and never suspected a thing? Not because they were careless, but because these agents were that good. No Russian accents, no suspicious behavior, no mistakes. Just ordinary American lives built on foundations of complete deception. Imagine waking up every single day and performing a role so perfectly that even your own children don't know who you really are. Your wife thinks she married an insurance salesman from Michigan. Your neighbors think you're just another middle-class father worried about mortgage payments and Little League games. But every night, while your family sleeps, you're encoding messages to Moscow, photographing classified documents, or meeting handlers in parking lots. This wasn't the Hollywood version of espionage with car chases and shootouts. This was something far more disturbing: the complete erasure of your own identity in service to a state that could disavow you at any moment. The KGB called it illegal work, using officers without diplomatic protection who lived under assumed identities for years or even decades. The Americans who hunted them called it the most dangerous form of espionage because these agents were invisible, woven so deeply into the fabric of American society that detecting them required catching them in the act or waiting for them to make a mistake. And some of them never did. The really unsettling part? The program that created these deep cover agents never really ended. It just evolved. The names changed, the technology updated, but the fundamental concept remained. Take a person, strip away their identity, rebuild them as someone else, and insert them into enemy territory to live a lie so complete that it becomes their truth. Today we're going to examine exactly how the system worked, how these agents maintained their covers for decades, and what it cost them psychologically to live as ghosts in someone else's life. It's 1978, and a man named David Jensen is sitting in a dentist's office in suburban Virginia, flipping through a Sports Illustrated while waiting for his appointment. He's been living in the United States for 6 years now, working as a sales representative for an electronics company, married to an American woman he met at a church social, father to a 3-year-old daughter who speaks only English. His neighbors know him as a quiet, hardworking man who grew up in rural Pennsylvania, served briefly in the Army, and now just wants to provide for his family. Everything about his life is meticulously normal, carefully constructed to be so unremarkable that no one would ever think to look closer. Except David Jensen doesn't exist. His real name is Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov, and he is a captain in the first chief directorate of the KGB. The man sitting in that dentist's office was born in Leningrad in 1945, recruited into intelligence work at age 19, and spent 4 years at a secret training facility learning to become someone else. His accent was scrubbed away through thousands of hours of language immersion. His mannerisms were rebuilt from the ground up by studying how Americans walk, talk, eat, and interact. He memorized the entire fictional backstory of David Jensen, schools he supposedly attended, jobs he supposedly held, people he supposedly knew. Every detail was documented, cross-referenced and rehearsed until it became reflexive. But the preparation went far beyond language and biography. Victor had to internalize American culture at a level that most Americans never consciously think about. He studied baseball statistics, not just to make conversation, but to genuinely understand why Americans care about them. He learned to maintain eye contact during conversations in a way that Russians typically don't. He practiced the American habit of smiling at strangers, something that would mark you as mentally unstable in Soviet society. He rewired his sense of humor, his body language, his relationship to personal space. The goal wasn't to pretend to be American. The goal was to become American in every way except loyalty. The training facility where this transformation occurred was known within the KGB as the American Village, though its official designation was simply Department S of the First Chief Directorate. Located outside Moscow, it was designed to replicate American suburban life with disturbing accuracy. The agents in training lived in American-style houses, shopped in American-style stores with American products, watched American television, read American newspapers, and spoke only English from the moment they woke up to the moment they went to sleep. Instructors who had lived in the United States for years played the roles of neighbors, coworkers, and random strangers, constantly testing the trainees' ability to maintain their covers under the mundane pressures of daily life. This wasn't a 6-month course. Deep cover training lasted between 3 and 5 years, and the attrition rate was significant. Some candidates couldn't master the accent. Others broke under the psychological strain of living as someone else continuously. A few were eliminated when background checks revealed details about their real lives that could potentially compromise their covers years down the line. The KGB was looking for a very specific type of person. Intelligent enough to maintain complex deceptions indefinitely, stable enough to endure years of isolation, flexible enough to adapt to unexpected situations, and fundamentally loyal enough that they would never consider defecting even when presented with the opportunity. Viktor Petrov was selected for this program because he possessed all of these qualities, plus one additional factor that made him particularly valuable. He had no close family ties in the Soviet Union. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 17. He had no siblings, no wife, no children. The KGB preferred illegals who were essentially alone in the world, people whose disappearance wouldn't generate questions or leave behind relationships that could be used as leverage. When Viktor Petrov ceased to exist and David Jensen was born, there was no one in the Soviet Union who would miss him or inadvertently compromise his cover by trying to contact him. The Jensen identity itself was built on a foundation of meticulous research and stolen documentation. The KGB had officers in the United States whose sole job was to identify deceased infants and children whose deaths had been recorded, but whose birth certificates remained in circulation. David Jensen had been a real person, born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1949, who died of pneumonia at age 2. The KGB obtained his birth certificate through contacts in the Pennsylvania Department of Health, then used it to build a complete paper trail: social security number, driver's license, school records forged and inserted into appropriate databases, employment history with companies that had since gone out of business or whose records were incomplete. By the time Viktor Petrov became David Jensen in 1972, the identity was so thoroughly documented that it could withstand background checks from employers, credit agencies, and even preliminary law enforcement inquiries. The only thing that could potentially unravel it would be someone who actually knew the real David Jensen before he died, which was statistically unlikely, given that the child had lived less than 3 years and had died more than 2 decades earlier. The insertion into American society was gradual and methodical. David Jensen didn't just appear in Virginia in 1972, he was built up slowly, starting with a brief period in Canada where he established his documentation and created an initial employment history. Then he crossed into the United States through a land border checkpoint, just another American returning from a sales trip. He worked several jobs in different cities, never staying long enough to form deep relationships, but always leaving a paper trail of tax returns, rental agreements, and unremarkable interactions. He joined a church, not out of religious conviction, but because it was expected in the communities where he lived, and because church membership created opportunities to meet people and build his legend. When he met the woman who would become his wife, it wasn't a romantic accident. She was identified in advance as a potential asset, daughter of a mid-level Defense Department contractor, access to social circles that included government employees and military personnel, temperament and background that suggested she would be an inattentive spouse who wouldn't ask too many questions about her husband's occasional late nights or unexplained absences. Victor, operating as David, courted her over the course of 8 months, constructed a relationship that felt genuine to her while remaining a calculated operation to him. The wedding was real. The marriage license was real. The house they bought together was real. And when their daughter was born in 1975, she was absolutely real. A human being created as an inadvertent element of tradecraft. A child who would grow up never knowing that her father's entire existence was a lie designed to facilitate espionage against her own country. This is where the psychological complexity of deep cover work becomes almost incomprehensible to outsiders. Viktor Petrov had to maintain emotional distance from his own child, to love her enough that it appeared genuine while never loving her so much that it would compromise his primary loyalty to Moscow. The operational work itself was carefully limited to maintain the cover. David Jensen was what the KGB classified as a sleeper agent, someone inserted into American society to live normally for years, building credibility and access, rarely conducting active intelligence gathering until activated for specific tasks. Most of his communication with Moscow occurred through dead drops, leaving coded messages or microfilm in predetermined locations to be retrieved by other officers. He had a handler he met with only twice a year, always in different cities, always in locations chosen for their anonymity: airport hotels, highway rest stops, shopping mall parking garages. The information he provided in those early years was minimal but valuable in its specificity. Names of Defense Department employees he met through his wife's family, office layouts and security procedures he observed during social visits to government facilities. Details about the social dynamics and personal vulnerabilities of individuals who might later be targeted for recruitment. The KGB was playing a long game with agents like Victor, investing years in building covers that might not be fully utilized for a decade or more. Then, in 1979, everything changed. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan escalated tensions between Moscow and Washington, and the CIA began a major counterintelligence push to identify and neutralize Soviet illegals operating in the United States. The FBI increased surveillance of known Soviet officials, making it harder for legal officers under diplomatic cover to run agents. This meant that illegals like Viktor Petrov suddenly became much more valuable and much more active. His handler's visits became more frequent. The intelligence he was asked to collect became more specific and more sensitive. This is when the operational security that had protected him for 7 years began to erode. Increased activity meant increased exposure. More frequent travel meant more opportunities for surveillance to detect patterns. More intensive intelligence collection meant more interactions with targets who might become suspicious. The KGB was aware of these risks, but considered them acceptable, given the deteriorating intelligence picture elsewhere. Deep cover agents, who had been carefully preserved as long-term assets, were now being used more aggressively because other collection methods were failing. Victor was assigned to cultivate a relationship with a mid-level analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency, someone he was introduced to through his wife's social network. The approach was textbook: casual friendship, developing over months, discovering shared interests, building trust through seemingly innocent interactions. Then carefully steering conversations toward the analyst's work, expressing interests that seemed natural given Victor's supposed background in electronics sales to defense contractors. The analyst, flattered by the attention and seeing no harm in discussing general aspects of his work with someone who seemed to already understand the industry, began sharing information. This was how most espionage actually worked during the Cold War. Not dramatic brush passes or midnight meetings, but mundane conversations at barbecues and golf courses where information leaked out gradually, so naturally that targets often didn't realize they were being exploited until confronted with evidence years later. Victor was good at this work because he genuinely liked Americans, found their openness and optimism refreshing compared to Soviet paranoia. This was one of the paradoxes of deep cover work. The better you were at assimilating into the target culture, the more you risked being genuinely assimilated, losing the ideological clarity that justified the deception in the first place. The relationship with a DIA analyst produced valuable intelligence for almost 2 years. Details about American assessment of Soviet military capabilities in Afghanistan, information about satellite reconnaissance programs, analysis of suspected weaknesses in Soviet communication security. Nothing that would individually compromise major American operations, but collectively valuable in helping Moscow understand how Washington was thinking about strategic issues. Then, in March 1982, the analyst was arrested. The FBI had been running a false flag operation, feeding him information through what he believed was a classified database, but was actually a controlled system designed to track who accessed specific files. When those files were later referenced in Soviet intelligence reports, the FBI was able to narrow down the possible sources. The analyst, confronted with evidence of his unauthorized disclosures, cooperated immediately. He provided detailed descriptions of everyone he had discussed his work with over the previous 2 years. David Jensen's name came up in the investigation. At first, it seemed routine. The FBI interviewed dozens of people in the analyst's social circle as part of standard counterintelligence procedures. But something about Jensen's responses triggered attention. Maybe it was the way he answered questions about his background. A little too polished, a little too perfect. Maybe it was something in his documentation that didn't quite align with other records. Or maybe it was just the kind of instinct that experienced counterintelligence officers develop after years of looking for deception. Whatever the initial trigger, once the FBI began examining David Jensen more closely, inconsistencies started appearing. Former employers who had vague memories of him but couldn't provide specific details. School records that existed in files but couldn't be corroborated by any living teachers or classmates. A background that was thoroughly documented but curiously isolated, lacking the kind of random connections and redundant details that characterize real lives. The FBI put him under surveillance. This is the nightmare scenario for any deep cover officer. Being investigated without knowing it, unable to activate escape protocols because you don't yet realize you've been compromised, continuing to live your normal life while every action is being recorded and analyzed for signs of intelligence activity. Victor didn't know he was being watched. He continued his regular routines, going to work, coming home to his family, attending his daughter's school events, maintaining his cover through pure momentum and habit. The FBI surveillance teams were patient. They watched him for 3 months, documenting his patterns, tracking his movements, looking for any deviation from the normal life of David Jensen. And Victor, disciplined and professional, gave them nothing. He had no scheduled meetings with his handler during this period. He made no suspicious phone calls, sent no unusual mail, visited no locations that couldn't be explained by his cover identity. To all external observation, he was exactly what he appeared to be, an unremarkable middle-class American living an unremarkable middle-class life. But the FBI was also examining his past more thoroughly, and that's where the cover began to fail. Investigators located the hospital where David Jensen was supposedly born and discovered records of an infant who died in 1951. They interviewed elderly residents of the neighborhood where the real David Jensen had briefly lived and found no memories of a family by that name. They tracked down supposed former coworkers and found people who remembered someone matching his description but whose recollections were vague and contradictory, suggesting carefully staged encounters rather than genuine long-term employment. The evidence was circumstantial but accumulating. The FBI couldn't prove that David Jensen was a Soviet illegal, but they had enough doubt about his identity to justify more aggressive investigation. In June 1982, they made their move. Victor was approached by agents as he left work one evening, asked to come to the field office for a voluntary interview about the ongoing investigation into the DIA analyst. He knew immediately that he had been compromised. The approach was too direct, too confident. They wouldn't be this bold unless they already had something. He had seconds to make a decision that would determine the rest of his life. He could go with the agents and attempt to maintain his cover through interrogation, relying on his training and the strength of his documentation to create enough doubt that they couldn't prosecute. He could attempt to escape, activate protocols that would get him out of the United States and back to the Soviet Union, abandoning his wife and daughter and everything he had built over 10 years. Or he could do what he had been trained to do in this exact scenario: comply, assess, and adapt. Victor went with the FBI agents. He maintained his identity as David Jensen. He answered every question calmly and consistently, sticking to his legend, showing no indication that he was anything other than a slightly confused American citizen who couldn't understand why he was being interrogated about his background. The FBI interviewers were experienced and skilled. They asked questions designed to trap him in inconsistencies, referenced details about his supposed past that didn't exist, created psychological pressure by suggesting they already knew he was lying. But Victor had been preparing for this moment for more than a decade. Every answer was consistent with his documented history. Every response was calibrated to be neither too detailed nor too vague. He maintained the persona of David Jensen so completely that even under intense pressure, there was no crack in the facade. After 8 hours of interrogation, the FBI had to release him. They had suspicions, they had circumstantial evidence, but they didn't have proof. Walking out of that building at 2 a.m, Victor knew his operational life in the United States was over. Even if the FBI couldn't prove their case, he was now marked, watched, compromised. He couldn't continue intelligence work. His cover, while technically intact, was effectively burned. He needed to get out, but leaving wasn't simple. The KGB had protocols for extracting compromised illegals, but those protocols took time to activate. Dead drops had to be checked, messages had to be encoded and transmitted, escape routes had to be prepared, and every day he remained in the United States, he was being watched. The FBI surveillance teams were now overt, making no effort to hide their presence. They wanted him to know he was being watched, wanted to create psychological pressure that might force a mistake. Victor continued his normal life, going to work, coming home, maintaining the absolute discipline of his cover because that was all he had left. His wife asked him about the FBI interview, worried and confused. He told her it was a misunderstanding related to the investigation of someone he barely knew, that everything would be fine. He lied to her with the same ease he had lied to her for their entire marriage, and she believed him because she had always believed him. 3 weeks after the FBI interrogation, Victor activated his escape protocol. It was a Sunday morning. He told his wife he was going to the hardware store to buy supplies for a home repair project. Instead, he drove to a shopping mall parking lot 40 miles away, left his car in the lot, and walked to a predetermined location where a vehicle was waiting with license plates, cash, and a new set of identification documents. He drove north toward Canada, using back roads and avoiding major highways, moving through a network of safe houses maintained by the KGB for exactly this purpose. By the time his wife realized he wasn't coming home, Victor was already across the border into Canada. 24 hours later, he was on a flight to East Berlin. 3 days after walking out of his house in suburban Virginia, he was back in Moscow, being debriefed by officers from the 1st Chief Directorate who wanted to understand exactly what had gone wrong and what American counterintelligence knew about other illegals still in place. What he left behind was chaos and trauma. His wife had to confront the reality that her entire marriage had been a lie, that the man she loved had never really existed, that she had been used as an unwitting element of a foreign intelligence operation. His daughter, 7 years old, had to process the disappearance of her father and eventually the truth about what he had been. Federal agents went through their house methodically, seizing documents and personal items, looking for any evidence that might expose other Soviet operations. The FBI investigation revealed the extent of Victor's intelligence work, the information he had collected, the assets he had developed, but they also discovered something else. He had been one of at least a dozen Soviet illegals operating in the United States at that time, part of a program that had been running continuously since the 1950s, and would continue running until the collapse of the Soviet Union and beyond. Some of these agents were eventually identified and arrested or expelled. Others were never caught, living out entire lives under false identities, dying with their secrets intact. The psychological cost of deep cover work is something that even the intelligence services that employ these agents struggle to fully understand. When Victor returned to Moscow, he was no longer Viktor Petrov, the young KGB officer who had left the Soviet Union in 1972. But he wasn't David Jensen either. He was something in between, a person who had lived a decade as someone else so completely that returning to his original identity felt like putting on a costume. He spoke Russian with an American accent that took months to fully suppress. He found Soviet society claustrophobic and paranoid after years of American openness. He had nightmares about his daughter, a child who was real, even though his identity as her father had been false. The KGB provided psychological support for returning illegals, recognizing that the transition back to Soviet life could be as traumatic as the initial insertion into American society. But there was a fundamental disconnect that couldn't be fully addressed. These officers had volunteered to erase themselves in service to the state, and the state had accepted that sacrifice without fully acknowledging what it meant. Victor had given up 10 years of his real life, created a family he had to abandon, and caused psychological trauma to people who had done nothing except trust him. And for what? Some useful intelligence, certainly, but nothing that changed the course of the Cold War or justified the human cost. The David Jensen case was never made public. The FBI didn't want to reveal how close they had come to losing him or acknowledge how many other illegals might still be operating undetected. Victor's wife and daughter were allowed to rebuild their lives away from public scrutiny, though the shadow of what had happened would follow them forever. In Moscow, Victor was commended for his service, promoted, and eventually assigned to train the next generation of illegals who would be inserted into Western countries. He taught them the technical skills, language, documentation, tradecraft, but he also tried to convey something more difficult, the psychological reality of living as someone else for years, the way it changes you in ways you can't predict or control, the impossible balance between maintaining your cover and maintaining your sanity. Most of his students were young and idealistic, convinced that their loyalty to the Soviet Union would be enough to sustain them through any hardship. Victor knew better, but he also knew that this knowledge couldn't really be taught, only experienced. The program continued through the 1980s, evolving as American counterintelligence methods improved but never fundamentally changing in its approach. The KGB, and later the SVR after the Soviet Union collapsed, continued to believe in the value of deep cover illegals as a long-term intelligence investment. The exposure of the illegals program in 2010, when the FBI arrested 10 Russian deep cover agents living in the United States, revealed that the methodology Victor had been trained in during the 1960s was still essentially the same. Take a person, strip away their identity, rebuild them as someone else, and insert them into enemy territory to live a lie for years or decades. What makes this form of espionage particularly unsettling isn't the theft of secrets or the violation of national security. It's the fundamental attack on identity itself, the willingness of both the intelligence services and the individual officers to treat human identity as something that can be discarded and reconstructed for operational purposes. Viktor Petrov ceased to exist, and David Jensen was manufactured in his place, and neither identity was entirely real or entirely false. The man who lived in suburban Virginia was a construction, but he was also a lived experience that shaped the person underneath the cover in ways that couldn't be erased by simply returning to Moscow. The people who knew David Jensen, particularly his wife and daughter, had to confront an even more disturbing reality. The person they loved had never existed, but their love for him had been completely real. Every memory they had was tainted by the knowledge of deception, but the emotions they had felt were genuine. This creates a kind of ontological crisis that most people never have to face. How do you process a relationship that was real to you but fraudulent to the other person? How do you grieve for someone who never died because they never actually existed? These are the uncomfortable truths about deep cover intelligence work that get glossed over in popular depictions of espionage. The reality is far more psychologically complex and morally ambiguous than stories about heroic spies fighting for their countries. These are operations that deliberately create trauma, that use human relationships as operational tools, that treat identity as disposable and families as collateral damage. Both sides engaged in this during the Cold War, and both sides continue to do so today under different names and slightly updated methodologies. The current iteration of this program is more sophisticated in its use of technology, but fundamentally unchanged in its human cost. Modern illegals have access to better documentation, more secure communications, and more thorough background research on their target identities. But they still face the same psychological challenge, living a complete lie for years while maintaining the mental discipline to never forget who they really are and what they're actually doing. Intelligence services justify this approach by arguing that deep cover agents provide access to information that cannot be obtained any other way, that the strategic value outweighs the human cost, that this is simply a necessary component of national security in a world of competing powers. But there's something fundamentally disturbing about the willingness to treat human identity as raw material for intelligence operations, to create entire fictional lives, and then abandon the real people, caught up in those fictions when operational necessity requires it. Viktor Petrov spent the last years of his life teaching others how to do what he had done, knowing that he was perpetuating a system that had cost him a decade of his real life and left psychological scars on people who had trusted him. He died in Moscow in 2004, at age 59, from a heart attack that may have been stress-related. His death was not publicly announced. There was no obituary. The few people who knew both of his identities remembered him as a skilled officer who had served his country with distinction, and also as a man who had paid a price for that service that couldn't be adequately measured or compensated. The house in suburban Virginia where David Jensen lived with his family was eventually sold. The woman who had been his wife remarried years later, though friends said she never fully recovered from the betrayal. The daughter grew up knowing that her father had been a Soviet spy, a piece of information that shaped her entire understanding of her own childhood and identity. She gave one interview in the late 1990s, speaking anonymously about what it was like to discover that your father was someone completely different than who you thought he was. She said the hardest part wasn't the deception itself, but the knowledge that she would never know what parts of their relationship had been real and what parts had been performance. This is what deep cover work actually looks like when you strip away the mythology and examine the human reality. It's not glamorous or exciting. It's people living in a constant state of dissociation, maintaining facades that become so complete they start to forget where the cover ends and their real self begins. It's families built on lies, relationships that are simultaneously genuine and fraudulent, and psychological costs that persist long after the operational work has ended. The KGB's American Village still exists in a modified form, now run by the SVR, to train illegals for insertion into Western countries. The methods have been updated, the technology improved, but the fundamental approach remains unchanged. Take a person, erase their identity, rebuild them as someone else, and send them to live a lie for years. Because as long as nations compete for intelligence advantages, there will always be a use for people willing to disappear into someone else's life, to sacrifice their real identity in service to objectives that may or may not justify the human cost. For those of us who've never had to live under deep cover, it's almost impossible to fully comprehend what that experience does to a person. Imagine waking up every morning and having to consciously remember who you're pretending to be before you can get out of bed. Imagine looking at your own child and knowing that your love for them is real, but your identity as their parent is completely fabricated. Imagine spending years building relationships that feel genuine while never forgetting that you're fundamentally lying to everyone you claim to care about. This is the reality that Viktor Petrov and thousands of officers like him have experienced. Some of them completed their missions and returned home. Others were caught and imprisoned. A few defected, unable to maintain the deception any longer or convinced that the cause they were serving wasn't worth the sacrifice. And some simply disappeared, their fates unknown, their real identities lost even to the services that deployed them. The story of deep cover intelligence work is ultimately a story about the malleability of human identity and the extremes to which states will go to gather information. It's about the willingness to treat people as instruments, to use their capacity for relationship building and their ability to deceive as weapons in conflicts that may outlast their own lifetimes. And it's about the price that individuals pay when they agree to erase themselves, a price that includes not just the years spent under cover, but the permanent psychological impact of having lived as someone else so completely that returning to your original identity feels like yet another form of deception. Stop for a second. I need to ask you something that maybe no one has ever asked you before. Have you ever felt that deep unease, like the world they've shown you is just an edited version of reality? Like there's a deeper layer of truth that only certain people have access to? I know you feel this, because people like us, we simply can't accept superficial answers. And I want you to know something. That feeling doesn't make you paranoid or conspiratorial. It makes you someone who still has the courage to question. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment when you realized that the world of international politics isn't what it seems? It could be a news story that didn't add up, an event that was explained too conveniently, or simply an intuition you could never explain. Write it like this. My awakening was when, and complete it with your experience. Your story might be exactly what another person needs to hear to understand they're not alone in this journey of searching for truth. Sometimes, knowing we're not the only ones questioning is the first step to finding the real answers. Now let's continue uncovering how these operations really worked and what they reveal about the machinery of state power that operates in the shadows of our ordinary lives. If you made it this far, it's because, just like me, you're fascinated by the secrets that governments prefer to keep hidden. And look, this isn't just curiosity. It's a need to understand the real world behind the official curtains. I created this channel exactly for people like you, who feel they deserve to know the truth about how power really works. Here you'll find stories that never make it to the news, operations that were erased from official records, and deep analyses of the methods that shape our geopolitical reality. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. because every week I bring exclusive investigations about the world of international intelligence. And look, it's not just entertainment, it's knowledge that will change your perspective on world politics forever. Come join this community of people who aren't satisfied with superficial versions of the facts. The like also really helps the channel grow and continue bringing this content that you can't find anywhere else. Until the next revelation,